Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga, who is also vice chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas. I got a lot to cover, and I'm going to jump right in. Mr. Pollock, good seeing you again. I'm going to start with you. This past summer, you wrote an article entitled, "Could the Fed Stop Its Huge Losses by Not Paying Interest on Its Deposits from Banks?" Well, you certainly didn't bury the lead on that. So at the time of the article, you noted that the Fed's operating losses had reached, as you put it, I believe, a mind-boggling $234 billion. Can you explain briefly how the Fed got to this point and how they are essentially running a negative balance?
Thank you, Congressman. Of course, the losses keep going. They're up over $240 billion now and rising. They come basically because the Federal Reserve built a balance sheet that looks in important measure like a 1980s savings and loan institution. That is to say, they invested extremely long at extremely low rates, and they borrowed extremely short at what looked like low rates at the time and became normal rates. 4% is a normal short-term rate. 6% is a normal, historically speaking, interest rate. And the Fed is simply upside down, just like the savings and loans were, so they have a big negative net interest margin, negative net interest income, and hugely negative net profits, and negative capital.
Well, I'm assuming that banks would not be real happy if the Fed stopped paying on those excessive reserves. But is there a financial risk to the economy because of the Fed's current position?
There is a risk to the economy through the deficit because the Fed's losses increase the deficit and increase the government debt, which we are all worried about. If the Fed stopped paying interest on reserves, of course the banks would be unhappy. The Fed determines how many reserves there are in the aggregate. In the aggregate, banks must hold the amount of reserves that the Fed creates. And that would be a huge loss to the banking system, to be sure, and would result, I feel quite confident, in a credit inflation as they tried to get out of their reserves.
All right. I've got about 2.5 minutes. Dr. Huizenga, good seeing you again as well. And I understand that research has long held that consumers would rather have an economy undergo massive unemployment instead of experiencing surging inflation, according to some studies. I'm curious if you believe that is the case, but last year, research from the Federal Reserve Board economists also found that Americans are willing to accept higher unemployment if it meant low inflation, suggesting Americans are willing to trade an increase in the unemployment rate by up to 0.6 or just a little over half a percentage point to lower inflation by 1 percentage point. To put it in context, in order to lower Biden inflation from its June 2022 peak of 9% down to 2%, Americans would have to accept an unemployment rate close to 8%. I have a hard time believing that that would be the case, but would this be evidence that Americans have long preferred the Fed to prioritize fighting inflation rather than employment? I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, the exact trade-off, I don't think exists in any polling data, but I think it's clear that people have a tremendous distaste for inflation. It's an economically destructive phenomenon, and when we reached 9.1% inflation in June of 22, the overwhelming unhappiness of the American public was visible to everyone, and the Fed took steps to reduce it. It is interesting that in doing so, when Chairman Powell announced the strategy in Jackson Hole, he made the point that they were going to focus on inflation and exclusively inflation. They were going to turn into a single mandate Fed for that period because there was no way to get back to sustained employment growth without returning inflation to the 2% target. So the whole point of that exercise was not to impose a trade-off on Americans, but to give them better employment and better inflation outcomes.
Do you think there is an appetite or a willingness to accept that trade-off?
I think that the American public will accept hardship in the interest of national gains, but the issue for the Fed is how, over long periods of time, not for any particular episode, to deliver both price stability and good employment outcomes, and that's the issue that should be focused on, the average performance over long periods.
All right, I appreciate it. My time's about ready up. Mr. DeVay, I'm going to send you a question about housing and the Chicago Feds district, which includes my congressional district. So with that, Mr. Chairman, my time's up. I yield
Gentleman
back.
yields back. The